The world has a way of testing your patience at the exact moment you think you've earned some peace. I learned that the hard way when I stepped out for a 30-minute grocery run and returned to find two self-appointed HOA cops prowling through my off-grid cabin like they were searching for buried treasure. Before we begin, tell me which country you're watching from and make sure you like and subscribe for more stories. The problem started the moment I moved back to the woods. My cabin sat on acreage I inherited from my grandfather, tucked beyond a gravel road that hardly anyone remembered existed. The place wasn't inside any association boundaries, and the nearest HOA community was half a mile away on the opposite side of a ridge. That should have been the end of the story, except there was always someone who tried to expand their imaginary kingdom. In this case, it was a cluster of residents who styled themselves as the Neighborhood Compliance Patrol, a phrase that felt like it had been ripped from a novelty t-shirt and inflated with too much authority. They had uniforms cobbled together from tactical vests and stitched patches ordered from hobby websites. They drove a golf cart caravan and kept a stack of citation slips they printed themselves. Most people humored them because arguing felt like more work than ignoring. I didn't expect to cross paths with them. My property stood entirely outside their reach. The cabin had always been my retreat, a place where the scent of pine hung in the air and the world quieted enough that I could hear the creek whisper through the stones. That morning, I cleaned up the porch, locked the door, and drove into town for milk and hardware supplies. 30 minutes, that was all. Half an hour later, I rolled back into my driveway and immediately felt the shift in the air, the kind that prickles along the spine. The door to the cabin stood ajar. Not wide, but just off enough to reveal someone had pushed their way in. The steps looked freshly scuffed. My first thought was that an animal had found its way inside, but then I noticed the golf cart parked near my woodpile, its sides decorated with amateur badge decals and a stenciled phrase announcing Security Division. A second cart waited on the edge of the trees, engine still humming lightly. I walked toward the cabin with the kind of steady focus that comes when adrenaline sharpens everything. Through the windows, I caught flashes of movement. Two people in matching vests wandered around like they were documenting a crime scene. One opened cabinets. The other photographed grain sacks stacked neatly along the wall. They looked out of place in the quiet interior, as if some parody of law enforcement had been teleported into a cabin built with real work and real history. They moved with an inflated confidence, convinced they had every right to be there. Their gait carried the tone of people who believed they had the world figured out, as long as the world stayed small enough to fit between the HOA street lamps. They inspected my shelves, my tools, and even the old radio my grandfather kept beside the hearth. At one point, they examined my solar battery system, scribbling in a notebook like they were preparing a report no one would ever read. The longer I watched, the more their fantasy unraveled. Nothing they touched had anything to do with them. None of it fell under any rule, boundary, or jurisdiction. They weren't even supposed to be within shouting distance of my property line. Yet they carried on, convinced that authority could be invented with enough patches and allowed enough certainty. My trail camera had captured everything from the moment they pulled up. They had climbed the porch steps, peered through windows, and pushed the door open without hesitation. To them, this was routine. To me, it was a violation carved deep into the heart of the place I valued most. I stepped inside. They froze. Their faces shifted through a series of expressions that tried to reconcile surprise with their imagined authority. I didn't speak, and I didn't need to. Their posture wavered. The structure of their confidence slid off them like ash. Silence filled the cabin. The heavy kind that leaves no room for excuses. They backed toward the door, awkwardly attempting to maintain composure. Their notebooks trembled slightly. Their hands hovered near utility belts stuffed with flashlights, tape measures, and laminated rule sheets. I could see the moment they realized they had wandered far outside the bubble that usually protected them. The wilderness was unamused by theatrics. They retreated down the steps and hurried toward the carts, each step faster than the last. Gravel kicked behind their wheels as they sped toward the ridge, disappearing around the bend with the urgency of children caught where they shouldn't be. Once they were gone, the cabin seemed to exhale. I walked through each room, checking the corners they'd disturbed. Nothing had been taken, but the air carried the aftertaste of intrusion, the faint echo of people who tried to create authority where none existed. I gathered the trail camera footage and the timestamps from my security system. Every moment was perfectly recorded. The sheriff's office sat 15 minutes away. The deputy on duty didn't bother disguising the disbelief in his eyes as he reviewed the footage. He recognized the self-appointed HOA cops immediately. They had been warned before. Trespassing, impersonating authority, and entering a dwelling without permission were not hobbies the law found amusing. By the next morning, real deputies arrived at their homes with warrants. The fabricated badges, uniforms, and citation pads were seized. The carts, once symbols of their pretend jurisdiction, were now evidence stacked neatly on trailers. Their HOA disavowed them instantly, claiming no knowledge, though everyone knew they attended meetings weekly and made themselves fixtures of neighborhood gossip. The news spread across the ridge quickly. Some residents felt relieved. Others shook their heads. A few laughed at how far imagination can stretch when matched with unchecked ego. As for me, I returned to the cabin and closed the door with a renewed sense of ownership. The woods felt steady again. The world outside still spun with human theatrics, but the cabin remained rooted in something older and quieter. Life settled back into its rhythm. The creek continued its soft conversation with the stones, and the breeze carried the scent of pine across the porch. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt reaffirmed. My place was still mine, binding me to a history that couldn't be rewritten by people who believed authority could be printed on cardstock. That 30-minute trip revealed a strange truth. Sometimes the loudest false authority collapses in the presence of calm ownership. Sometimes the forest itself reminds intruders where the real boundaries lie. And that was the day the fantasy of the HOA cops dissolved in the quiet of an old cabin standing exactly where it always had. Tell me which country you're watching from, and make sure you like and subscribe for more stories.